Welcome to the second Public Information Center, or PIC, for the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study. The City of Mississauga is completing this study as a master plan under the Municipal Class Environmental Assessment process for the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed. All of the slides you will see in this presentation are available at the city's website, which is www.mississauga.ca/flooding. My name is Melanie Ivy Sampson, and I will be providing the narration for each slide in the presentation. I'm a water resources engineer in training, working with Amanda McKay, the project engineer for Phase 2 of the study, and working under the direction of Karen Hoffbauer and Steve Braun, all of whom are water resources engineers at Matrix. Of course, we would have much rather met people in person, but we've had to adapt our presentation and this PIC to be online due to COVID-19. Through the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study and the Municipal Class Environmental Assessment process, the City of Mississauga is seeking to understand the urban flooding in the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed in order to find solutions to protect existing residences and businesses. The study was completed as two phases. Phase 1, shown in purple, expanded upon previous studies of the overland spill from Little Etobicoke Creek during high flow conditions, particularly in the Dixie Road and Dundas Street area. Phase 2, shown in green, identified overland urban flood risk throughout the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed and developed, assessed, and recommended mitigation measures. The objectives of the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study are 1. To quantify and account for the flow entering other subwatersheds as a result of spill originating from the creek near Dixie Road. 2. To identify areas at risk of riverine and urban flooding. And 3. To develop a plan to mitigate flood risks to people, property, and infrastructure. This PIC provides interested parties the opportunity to identify any local information or concerns. At the end of the study, a master plan report documenting the entire study will be available for public review. This slide outlines the Municipal Class Environmental Assessment, or EA, process, and specifically its 5 phases. The selection of required phases within the EA process is known as the schedule and is based on the complexity, size, and potential risks associated with a project. The Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study and Master Plan falls under Schedule B, and the project will be considered complete following Phase 2. Currently, we are completing Phase 2 alternative solutions. We have identified and evaluated alternative solutions and have come up with preliminary preferred solutions for 6 areas throughout the watershed. Through this PIC, we very much value your opinion and hope to receive feedback about our process and analysis of the alternatives. This will be used to finalize the preferred alternative solutions. Once completed, we will finalize the project report. At that point, we will prepare the notice of completion and the project report will be posted online for public review. The city will then be permitted to move ahead with implementation of the preferred solutions as funding becomes available. While flooding along Little Etobicoke Creek has been known for decades, our project timeline begins with background as early as 2012, when advanced computer methods have enabled modernization of flood risk mapping. In 2012, new computer modeling was used to define the very complex flooding that occurs in the area surrounding the intersection of Dixie Road and Dundas Street, which I will refer to as Dixie-Dundas from here on. The significant flood event that occurred on July 8, 2013 was included in the modeling that was completed in 2015. An expansion of the modeled area to define flooding right down to the QEW was completed as part of Phase 1 of this study and master plan. Phase 1 of this master plan began in 2017 and the initial PIC occurred in 2018. Phase 2 of the study began in 2019 with a separate model of the entire watershed to identify flood clusters, flood remediation focus areas, and potential mitigation efforts. This brings us to this PIC with the intent of finalizing the master plan by the end of 2020. As mentioned previously, the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study was completed in 2 phases. The Phase 1 study, which focused on defining the flood extent from the spill at Queen Frederica Drive near Dixie Road, is now complete. The Dixie-Dundas Flood Mitigation Project was initiated in 2019 to protect flood-vulnerable residences and businesses, as well as to enable future growth as outlined in the Dundas Connects Master Plan. For more information on that concurrent study, please visit the city's website at www.mississauga.ca/flooding. Phase 2 of the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study is the focus of this PIC and includes 4 general tasks: flood characterization modeling, flood cluster identification and flood causes, flood mitigation modeling, and flood mitigation alternatives evaluation. We will now provide some background on flood terminology to assist in your understanding of the rest of this presentation. It's not often that flood modelers get the advantage of seeing a real-world event that somewhat confirms or validates their models. What is being shown in the video here is a storm that everyone in Mississauga will remember, the July 8, 2013 storm. We can see cars along Dundas Street looking east trying to cross through the Queen Frederica roadway. They shouldn't be doing this, of course, and later in the video there are individuals trying to get across too. This situation exactly illustrates why the city undertook this study and why the city carries out flood mitigation projects. It should also be noted that this flood consisted about half of the water that would occur under the regulatory event Hurricane Hazel. The map shown in the bottom right corner demonstrates the depths of the flood under the regulatory storm event. As you can see from this video, the depths and velocities depicted at this intersection highlight some very dangerous conditions. There are different types of flooding which can be quite intricate, complicated, and involve multiple aspects. Flooding is typically classified as riverine flooding or urban flooding. Riverine flooding occurs when the banks of the river are overtopped and areas adjacent to the river are flooded with water. Urban flooding occurs when storm sewer capacities are exceeded, catch basins overflow, and/or grading doesn't provide a clear flow path. It is important to recognize where unwanted water in flooding comes from. In the case of Phase 2 of the study, we're mainly talking about urban flooding. This means that people and property are at risk in areas throughout the watershed where the overland flow pathways or storm sewer system do not provide proper drainage during high-intensity storm events. Urban flooding can also occur independently within private property due to poor lot grading and/or blockages within downspouts, private ditches, or catch basin inlets. It's certainly true that riverine flooding can also occur independently and at times quite close to urban flooding on private property. This typically occurs on properties located within the floodplains adjacent to the creek. The focus of the concurrent Dixie-Dundas flood mitigation project is to solve the major system riverine flooding by keeping flows within the Little Etobicoke Creek Valley corridor. Again, more information about this project is available at the city's website. There are multiple government agencies working together to regulate flood risk and maintain drainage infrastructure within the City of Mississauga. For Little Etobicoke Creek, the City of Mississauga is responsible for road drainage, storm sewers, parks, the greenbelt, trails, trees, and creek erosion and flow management. The Region of Peel is responsible for regional roads, sanitary sewers, and water mains. And the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, or TRCA, is responsible for floodplain mapping and management policies, flood forecasting and warning, flood messaging, and flood hazard management. These agencies have all come together to complete this comprehensive master plan study. The next section we will go through is the approach of the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study. Phase 1 of the study expanded upon previous studies of high flow conditions where Little Etobicoke Creek, within the TRCA jurisdiction, spills to an adjacent watershed, under the Credit Valley Conservation or CVC jurisdiction. The Phase 1 objectives were to identify the extents of flooding resulting from this spill, determine the quantity of flow entering other watersheds. The Phase 1 technical assessment included expanding the existing model to allow for additional spill assessments of the July 8, 2013 and regional storm events. The map on the right shows the outcome of the Phase 1 study demonstrating the flood limit and maximum depth during the regional event. If that were to occur again over the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed, we would predict a flow of approximately 200 cubic meters per second at the area of spill on Queen Frederica Drive. At that point, over 130 of that 200 cubic meters per second jumps the bank of the creek and starts heading down Queen Frederica Drive. Again, the concurrent Dixie-Dundas flood mitigation project objectives are to seek solutions to protect existing flood-vulnerable residences and businesses by addressing flooding from Little Etobicoke Creek, and enable future growth and fulfill the Dundas Connects master plan by lifting the development restrictions at the two designated special policy areas that were implemented due to flooding. Now let's look at Phase 2 of the study in a bit more detail. We began Phase 2 with flood characterization modeling. We developed an overland hydraulic model of the entire watershed and used the model to characterize flood risk, which is discussed further in a few slides. The flood risk characterization allowed us to identify flood clusters, which are areas of high and moderate flood risk. Each cluster was reviewed in detail to determine the reason for flooding, such as limitations on sewer capacity or lack of overland flow path. Our team then worked with the city to determine which of the flood clusters would be taken to the next phase of analysis to come up with alternatives to reduce the flood risk. To support the characterization, we also developed a model to assess the capacity of the existing sewer system and to identify potential areas where backwater from the river could limit the effectiveness of flooding solutions. 6 focus areas were selected to develop alternative solutions to mitigate flooding. The solutions identified for each area were evaluated against specific criteria in order to select and recommend a preferred solution. The Little Etobicoke Creek watershed has experienced flooding and erosion concerns recorded back to the 1970s. The recent large flood event on July 8, 2013 resulted in many reported flooding-related incidents and damage. The Little Etobicoke Creek watershed covers approximately 23 square kilometers and extends from north of Highway 401 to south of Dundas Street. As the entire watershed was too large to develop a single two-dimensional hydraulic model, the watershed was broken up into the upper and lower areas. The divide between these two areas was Eastgate Parkway, a large road with embankments that limit water from traveling from one side to the other. The upper area of the watershed is mostly industrial and commercial land uses, with very few residential areas. The lower area of the watershed largely comprises residential communities and became the focus of the flood mitigation solutions. Current Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry practices characterize flood risk based on depth, velocity, and the depth velocity product, as shown in the table on this slide. Flood risk rankings include low-risk areas that are flooded but vehicular and pedestrian access are still feasible, medium-risk areas that do not permit vehicular access but pedestrian access is possible, and high-risk areas that do not facilitate safe access of any kind. When evaluating alternative solutions, the flood risk improvement was quantified based on the change in flooded area between the existing and proposed conditions, as shown on the right. When an area went from a higher risk to a lower risk, such as blue to green, there was a reduction in flood risk. And when an area went from lower risk to higher risk, such as green to red, there was an increase in flood risk. For each focus area, both the total areas with improved or eliminated flood risk and increased flood risk were tallied to support the evaluation. The next series of videos and maps will show the results of the various modeling and analyses completed for the upper and lower areas of Little Etobicoke Creek. This video shows the flood risk mapping for the upper area of Little Etobicoke Creek during 6 different rainfall events. These events are described by their statistical return frequency. That is to say, the 2-year event happens on average every 2 years, or in other words, the 2-year event has a 50% chance of occurring each year. At the other end of our list is the 100-year event, which on average happens every 100 years, or has a 1% chance of occurring each year. This video shows the modeled results of the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 25-year, and 100-year events, and the 100-year event with a climate change forecast applied. As shown, flood risk increases as the storm intensity increases. There are some areas in the model where high-risk flooding occurs, but because they are in park areas or green spaces, there is a lesser overall risk to people or property. These areas do not require flood mitigation. The following video shows the flood risk mapping for the lower area of Little Etobicoke Creek during the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 25-year, and 100-year events, as well as the 100-year climate change scenario storm event. As shown, flood risk increases as the storm intensity increases. It is important to note that roads act as overland flow pathways during large storm events and therefore are intended to be flooded. The capacity of the storm sewer is sized only to contain the 10 to 25-year storm events, before surcharging to surface where flow should then travel along the road safely until it reaches a watercourse. Green flood risk areas along roads and right-of-ways are therefore expected during events greater than the 10-year storm. A level of service analysis, which is an assessment of the sewer system's design storm capacity, was completed to help inform flood characterization and potential alternative solutions. The following map shows the level of service for the upper area of Little Etobicoke Creek. In the case of Little Etobicoke Creek, much of the sewer system was designed in the 1960s and was not designed to the same standards as today. This is why we experience urban flooding during the lower intensity storms. The manholes and sewers shown in green have a level of service greater than the 10-year storm. Areas in blue and purple are manholes and sewers that only convey flows between the 2 and 10-year storms. Orange manholes and sewers are areas that are full even during the 2-year storm event, and these become key areas for investigation of flooding. The following map shows the level of service for the lower area of Little Etobicoke Creek. In a couple of slides, you will see how the level of service analysis aligns well with identified flood clusters. The video shown here demonstrates the effects of backwater from Little Etobicoke Creek on the storm sewer system. Green areas are manholes and sewers with full capacity, which means the backwater from the creek does not reach the pipe invert. Yellow areas are manholes and sewers with some capacity, and red areas are manholes and sewers that have no capacity, meaning they are full of water from the creek. Areas with significant backwater from the river will have limited capacity to convey urban drainage. This limits the effectiveness of some flood mitigation solutions. As you can see in the upper area of the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed, there are only a few areas directly adjacent to the river that are affected by backwater. The same analysis was also completed for the lower area of the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed. As shown in this video, the sewer system in the lower area is more affected by backwater, particularly the communities directly adjacent to the creek. As you will see in the alternative analyses, some of the potential flood mitigation solutions are less effective because of this issue. The completed analysis led to the identification of over 70 flood clusters within the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed. Each flood cluster was initially classified to help identify potential solutions and to confirm whether additional assessment was needed. Most flood clusters in the upper area are on private industrial or commercial properties. These were recommended for notification and education of the property owner and are shown with red stars. Note that modeled flooding in these industrial areas may not be accurate, as there may be private stormwater servicing that are not represented in the city's model. Green stars indicate flood clusters related to riverine flooding. These areas are identified for discussion with the TRCA. Yellow stars indicate where modifications to the overland flow routes could be beneficial to allow a more direct or suitable drainage pathway to the creek. Orange stars indicate issues that just require monitoring to confirm conditions and potential flood extents. Blue stars indicate where further detailed assessments or models are required to find suitable flood mitigation solutions. And lastly, gray stars indicate locations where the focus area analysis, described in the following sections, enabled us to recommend a solution to the flooding risk. No focus areas were selected in the upper area of Little Etobicoke Creek. We will now move on to the flood clusters identified in the lower area of Little Etobicoke Creek. As most of this area is residential, many of the clusters were identified as needing additional modeling or assessment. The separate study, noted here in purple, is covered under the Dixie-Dundas Flood Mitigation Project, which is currently ongoing. 14 flood clusters in the lower area are within the 6 focus areas selected by the city. At this point, we will take a closer look at the 6 focus areas. The focus areas selected for further analysis in the lower area are shown in red on this map. Focus areas 1 and 2 were chosen because of the potential use of adjacent park space, Golden Orchard Park and Kennedy Park, that are owned by the city and could implement a storage facility if feasible. Focus areas 3 to 6 are in close proximity to the creek and may have straightforward, easy to implement solutions that could benefit the neighboring residents. More detail on each of the individual focus areas will be provided in the upcoming slides. Note that the do nothing option is a required alternative under the Class EA process and was evaluated along with the other alternatives. Essentially, this option would assume that the current flooding is left to continue. There were four main criteria used to evaluate each of the alternative solutions: flood risk reduction, social impacts, downstream impacts or residual flooding, and capital costs. We'll begin with flood risk reduction. As mentioned earlier, flood risk reduction was evaluated using the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry risk characterization. For our purposes and considering the overall size of the focus areas, low improvement indicated a reduction in flood risk of 5,000 square meters or less. Medium improvement ranged from 5,000 and 10,000 square meters, and high improvement was 10,000 square meters or greater of area with reduced flood risk. The flood risk reduction criteria also considered other more subjective factors such as location and land use. For instance, a moderate risk reduction improving the access or egress of a major road will take precedence over a moderate risk reduction in a commercial parking lot. The social impacts considered local disruption due to construction, such as traffic delays, as well as long-term impacts, such as loss of park space. The anticipated reception by the public and agencies, including the City of Mississauga, Region of Peel, and TRCA, were considered under this criterion with a level of impact, low, medium, and high, signifying the level of disruption and likelihood of disagreement. I'll take this time now to note that the categories of low, medium, and high under each criterion do not necessarily align with the ideal outcome. For instance, high is the best outcome under flood risk reduction, but none or low are the best outcomes under social impacts. The downstream impacts or residual flooding is the opposite of flood risk reduction and is essentially the evaluation of potentially increasing flood risk at the location of interest or downstream. Risk levels were evaluated using the same risk characterization and threshold divisions as flood risk reduction. Additional subjective factors were also incorporated into these classifications. For instance, creating new flooding to properties contributed to a higher risk rating. Finally, the capital costs for each of the alternative solutions were considered. Low cost included solutions under $200,000. Medium cost solutions were between $200,000 and $500,000, and high cost solutions exceeded $500,000. Note that these costs do not include life cycle, flood damage assessment, or operation and maintenance costs. At this time, the economic benefit of combining solutions were not considered either. We will now go through each of the focus areas individually to discuss local considerations and the evaluation of the potential solutions. Focus Area 1 is centered around Golden Orchard Park, which is owned by the city. There are 3 flood clusters located within this area. The map on the left demonstrates the urban flooding during the 100-year storm. We tested many alternatives for this location, which included a stormwater storage facility in Golden Orchard Park, location 1A on the map on the right, upsizing sewer capacity for those sewers demonstrating capacity issues, 1B, additional inlets and localized regrading to direct flow into the inlets along Rathburn Road East, 1C, and creation of an overland flow path through the park, 1D. Options 1A, 1B, and 1D only showed minimal reductions in flood risk. When evaluated with the associated cost and social impacts, these options were not recommended to proceed. In particular, the storage facility could not capture flows as hoped due to the current sewer layout. Elevation differences make interception of flow from the Rathburn Road sewer infeasible without significant reconstruction. Additional inlets and localized regrading to direct flow into the inlets along Rathburn Road East, 1C, did prove promising based on the local modeling and is recommended. Option 1C reduces urban flooding near Hickory Drive, as well as reduces the amount of water traveling down to Golden Orchard Drive during the 100-year storm. The recommended option would help to address flood clusters LW20 and LW21. However, flood cluster LW22 will require further study to determine an appropriate mitigation solution. Focus Area 2 is centered around Kennedy Park, which is also owned by the city. There are 3 flood clusters within this area, and the flood risks are shown on the map on the left. Similar to Focus Area 1, a storage facility in Kennedy Park, 2A on the middle map, and upsizing sewer capacities, 2B, were simulated but resulted in little effectiveness due to sewer layout restrictions and backwater impacts. It is not recommended that the city pursue these 2 alternatives. Additional inlets and localized regrading were simulated, 2C, resulting in reduced flood extent in the area close to flood cluster LW27. A fire station is located in this area, and this alternative would thus improve accessibility of emergency services. Furthermore, creating an overland flow path through Kennedy Park towards the creek, 2D on the map on the right, can reduce the flood risk along Winding Trail. Therefore, measures 2C and 2D address flood clusters LW26 and LW27 and are recommended. Flood cluster LW25 requires further study to determine mitigation solutions. However, given the proximity of this location to the creek, there may be limited solutions besides floodproofing to prevent local flooding. For Focus Area 3, we see high flood risk along Running Brook Drive and flooding at flood cluster LW13. An outlet pipe through Cedar Brook Park, 3A on the map on the right, would significantly reduce the flooding at flood cluster LW13, eliminating high-risk areas, especially at the Westwood luxury apartments. This alternative also reduces high-risk velocity along Running Brook Drive, including flood cluster LW14, and increases the sewer function by providing an outfall to the creek. The large reduction in flood risk with the relatively low capital costs and social impacts make this the recommended option. With this train of thought in mind, further study should be made to evaluate the benefits of upsizing the existing sewer flowing towards the new outlet, 3B. Doing so could help alleviate the flooding at flood cluster LW11. The major issue behind Focus Area 4, as shown on the map to the left, is that the overland flow path to the creek is obstructed by urban development. To find a solution, we simulated curb cuts to create more defined flow paths at Highgate Crescent, 4A on the map on the right, and Graybrook Crescent, 4B. A curb cut for 4A created a moderate increase in flood risk to downstream properties, as well as impeding access and egress on Golden Orchard Drive. Therefore, it is not recommended to create this curb cut. However, 4B did provide improvement of flood risk at Graybrook Crescent with little negative impacts as the outlet would be directly to the creek. Therefore, it is recommended to pursue the 4B alternative to address flood cluster LW19. Since the overland flow route at 4A alone is not recommended, the feasibility of a storage facility at a Hickory Green Park, 4C, potentially in combination with the curb cut, is recommended for further study to reduce the flooding concern at flood cluster LW18. Focus Area 5 is located at the Headstone Crescent cul-de-sac adjacent to Little Etobicoke Creek and experiences medium to high flood risk as shown on the map to the left. Facilitating an overland flow path from Headstone Crescent to the creek, 5A on the map to the right, is recommended as this will alleviate the localized flooding and has low residual impacts since it outlets directly to the creek. Additional inlets and upsizing the outlet pipe, 5B, are also recommended as they would have relatively low capital costs and would further improve the urban flood risk. Finally, it is also recommended that public education be provided to residents of this area, especially those who have reverse slope driveways, 5C. These driveways are more susceptible to flooding as they are lower than the road elevation. These solutions will help reduce the medium and high risk flooding in flood cluster LW35. Similar to Focus Area 5, Focus Area 6 is located at the Taviton Court cul-de-sac, adjacent to Little Etobicoke Creek, and also experiences medium to high flood risk as shown on the map to the left. Facilitating an overland flow path from Taviton Court to the creek, 6A on the map to the right, eliminates the flooding issue for at least 3 properties located at the cul-de-sac. Though high velocities may occur along the proposed overland flow path, which is the city's right-of-way, the reduction in flooding extent at the 3 properties outweigh the risk. As this cul-de-sac outlets to the creek directly, additional inlets and upsizing the outlet pipe, 6B, are also recommended. These solutions will help reduce the medium and high risk flooding at flood cluster LW33. And now we will summarize the conclusions of the study and next steps. Up until now, we have shown ways that the city and Matrix have been working together to analyze urban flooding and find solutions to reduce flooding in the Little Etobicoke Creek watershed. However, there are steps that you, the public, can do to reduce flooding and ensure minimal damage to your property and belongings. As a property owner or manager, preparing for emergencies and being aware of flood risks is an important responsibility. We've extracted a few tips from the city's website to share, and these include having a sump pump installed or a portable water pump available in case water seeps into your basement, keeping easements clear, keeping drains around your property, including roadside catch basin inlets, free from debris, and reporting any blocked storm drains to 311. On the right, you can see a diagram with other examples to protect your property and belongings, including sealing basement entrances, waterproofing, installing a backflow prevention valve, and relocating critical contents from your basement. You can find these tips and more on the city's website. I do want to highlight the importance of staying involved. If a flood warning has been issued, please ensure to monitor local media, including the city's website, Twitter @CityMississauga, and Facebook feeds for updates. If you experience flooding, notify the city. These calls are monitored and helps the city identify areas of concern. In fact, calls from the July 8, 2013 flood were used to support flood cluster identification for this study. In conclusion, Matrix is in the process of completing the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study and Master Plan, and have done this in 2 phases. In Phase 1 of the study, the flood spill was mapped and led to the Dixie-Dundas Mitigation Project, a separate ongoing study. In Phase 2 of the study, the flood risk assessment and characterization has been completed for urban flooding. Matrix has identified flood clusters for consideration, followed by an evaluation of mitigation solutions for 6 focus areas covered in this presentation. At the end of the study, recommendations were made for the appropriate next steps for each of the focus areas and flood clusters. The next and final step of the study will be to integrate feedback we receive from you, the public, following this PIC so that we may integrate these comments into the final master plan. To conclude, please feel free to reach out to the 2 project managers for this study, Elizabeth Dollimore from the City of Mississauga or Karen Hofbauer from Matrix. If you would like to be included on the project mailing list or would like to provide input, please complete the project comment form available at www.mississauga.ca/flooding and submit this form via email to either Elizabeth or Karen, whose contact information are shown on the right. We will be accepting input and public comment regarding the information presented in this PIC until October 16, 2020. Thank you very much for viewing this PIC, and we look forward to hearing from you.